Hey folks, today we're out in the park with Irene, and today I want to show you some tips on how to get the sharpest portrait possible. Hey folks, if you haven't already, please jump over to mattgranger.com. Make sure you sign up to the mailing list. You'll get my free guide to portraiture, and you can check out my various download courses there at the workshops page. Okay, so how to get the sharpest portrait possible and why I'll always use a VC lens where possible. I'm going to go through and do a top line here for those of you who don't have the patience to see the whole thing, and then we'll actually go out with Irene to demonstrate each of them one by one. So first off, we're going to break this down into sections: gear, settings, then technique. So first off, gear I'll run through in the studio. Now, I'm going to be shooting with the new and fantastic Tamron 85mm VC lens and the Nikon D810. Of course, you can use lower quality gear and still get lovely portraits. Absolutely you can. But using the latest generation high-res sensor, you're going to have more tonal range, more color range, and more detailed, and you're just going to get a whole bunch more out of your files. And then of course, using high quality optics like this one, the sharper the lens, the sharper potential your overall portrait is going to have. Now, why I mentioned VC and why I like to use that, it's true that when we're talking through the different settings next up, you have to balance those out. This being a 1.8 lens, it lets in half a stop less light than a 1.4 prime. But the VC gives you more than that in terms of the extra stability you have. So on one hand, you get about 2 stops plus of slower shutter speed that you can realistically handhold because of the VC, offsetting by far the half a stop of extra light. But the VC is able to stabilize things down to a pixel level that by far more than makes up for that loss of light. So if I'm actually shooting away at say 100th of a second, small movements can introduce a huge amount of blurring on high-res sensors because each of the photo sites are so tiny. So with the lens being able to make those tiny little corrections, it can take you from having a reasonably sharp portrait to an absolutely amazingly sharp portrait. So that's why I'm going to be using the VC on throughout this, except for when I demo the difference between on and off. Next, let's talk about settings. Of course, settings, we're talking about the basic stuff. You've got your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed. So aperture, don't shoot wide open. Shooting between 2.8 to f4, you're going to get a sharper shot than you will wide open. Or in some lenses, even down at 5.6 to f8, you're going to get the best results. All of this we're going to demonstrate. I'm just doing a top line now. ISO, shoot at your lowest possible ISO depending on the overall situation. You'll get a better, more detailed and sharper looking shot. And then shutter speed, there's an old rule of thumb that you want your shutter speed to be at least as high as your focal length. So if you're shooting with 50mm, you want to be at least a 50th of a second. 200mm, at least a 200th of a second. We're going to go into more detail on that one. Finally is your technique. To get a really sharp portrait, it's not, rocket science. You want your subject to be staying as still as possible, and you want your camera sensor to be staying as still as possible. So that's going to come down to poses that allow the model to hold their pose really strongly, and then hand-holding technique, and again, VC to help you get the minimal amount of movement coming into your shot from the actual photo taking process. So let's head out and then go through each of those different points in detail and get some sharp portraits. To get maximum sharpness, don't shoot your lens wide open. Pretty much every lens ever made will be sharper if you stop it down a bit rather than shooting it wide open. Wide open is to get maximum light and to blur your background. But if you want to get the sharpest results, do the test for yourself on your particular lens. But normally, say you're using a prime lens, somewhere around f4 is usually about the sharpest. Some it's a range between 2.8 to f4, and some it'll even be up at f5.6 and f8. So do the test, but you will notice that the in-focus areas are overall sharper and you get more contrast from the shot, shooting usually around f4 compared to wide open. Let's do that test. So we shot away and it's really obvious. It's true for pretty much every lens. At f1.8 you can get beautiful blurred background, and with a high quality lens you can get quite good detail, but as you start to stop down you're going to see far more detail. So even going up to f2.8 already loads more detail. f4, same story, just seeing a whole load of detail. And then here by f5.6, well, wow, I mean, there's just oodles and oodles of detail there. Okay, another one that you really want to consider to get a really sharp portrait is to use the lowest possible ISO. No matter what camera you're using, higher ISOs just rob you of quality. Let's get some comparisons here with the D810 shooting down at its base. This shouldn't surprise anyone. Shooting the camera down at its lowest ISO, you just get the maximum potential color tonal range from your camera. Here going up to ISO 1200, you've lost a lot of color and tonal range, but on top of that, you've just got all of that smudged detail from the graininess that ISO gives you, from the noise you're getting. Here applying the luminance noise reduction, it just blurs all of the detail, so it's no longer sharp. Okay folks, as I said in the intro, it's a reasonable rule of thumb that you want to look at your focal length to work out your shutter speed. So if you're shooting with an 85mm, you want to shoot at least 1/80th of a second, maybe 1/100th. But when you're shooting with high-res cameras, you want to even increase that more. With something like a 36 megapixel sensor, any slight movement is going to result in a higher chance of blur than on a lower resolution camera. I know people who with these 36 and 40 megapixel cameras won't shoot below a 2/50th of a second despite the focal length. Now, of course, if you're putting your shutter speed up, that's going to have an impact on your aperture and your ISO, which I also gave you some guidelines at the start. So your VC can be really handy in getting around that. The compensation that gives you for any movement in the camera can mean that you can actually shoot at a lower shutter speed than you would ordinarily. So let's have a look at it on and off. All right, so let's go through and do some tests. Because there aren't too many 85mm primes, a classic portraiture lens, that are actually stabilized, let's go through and do it with the VC off and see what kind of shutter speeds we're actually able to handhold to get a perfectly sharp shot here. So I'm gonna start down at a 60th of a second. Oh, don't you make that angry face at me. Did you see that? She's so angry. Okay, with the VC off at a 60th of a second, I just wasn't getting them sharp regularly enough. Up at an 80th, I was probably getting half, 1/125th. That's where I'm getting kind of 2 out of 3 sharp, and you know, you're kind of in a safe territory. But up at 1/250th, I'm starting to get all of them pin sharp. Here going in nice and close, you can really see it. Okay, so now let's do the same, but with the VC on and see if that makes much of a difference, especially going in close. Like I said, when you really go in to check that fine detail, that's when you're gonna find that these extra steps we're taking and the VC are gonna make a big difference. With the VC on, whole different story. Even at a 60th, I was getting 9 out of 10 acceptably sharp here. So of course, an 80th, a 1/25th, and a 2/50th, all no problem whatsoever. So even on the back of the screen, I can see easily that down at a 60th, I'm still getting nice and sharp shots with this. So let's actually see how slow we can go with the VC, and keeping in mind, that's then going to give us more flexibility on our aperture. I found that down at a 40th of a second, I was still getting pretty much all of them pin sharp, and even some at a 25th. But note, down at those really low shutter speeds, your subject movement will become an issue even if the camera isn't. Our next tip will help with that. Our next section is technique, and that is a really important one. If you have the best equipment and the right settings but poor technique, you still won't get sharp portraits. So there's kind of 2 main variables. People have different ways to go about it. The way I like to do it is I'll put my elbows to my body, so then they're kind of anchored, push the camera back towards my head, and then I'll slowly exhale and then shoot on the end of the exhale. So you're less likely to have any kind of wobble coming in than if you take a breath in and hold it that way. And of course, as we already showed, the VC is going to give you a lot more latitude in your shutter speed anyway and counteract any slight movements you might have in the camera. The next point is choosing poses for your model and communicating with them to eliminate movement on their part. So look, obviously a pose that isn't too complicated and where they're kind of level on 2 feet and really grounded is where you're going to have the least chance of any movement. So if you stand kind of side on, feet slightly apart, your feet won't be in the shot anyway, but so you're nice and grounded. And let's do that one you had before where you had your hand up to your face and then the other hand onto your elbow. Yeah, that's the kind of pose that will be easy for her to hold without too much movement. If their hands aren't occupied, I find there's more chance of movement in the shot. Now, conversely, let's have you stand on 1 foot and do the little yoga hand stick. Now this, well, damn it, she's really stable, but this is the kind of pose where you're more likely to get some movement or too much joking around in the shot. I often will tease Irene when we're shooting and then, you know, I get a laugh when I was expecting her to be staying still. So something that I'll actually try to communicate, you are still wobbling. Something that I will actually communicate with them is, you know, they don't need to be a camera expert to get the concept. So if you just say, look, I'm doing a slower shutter speed, I need to get a really sharp shot here. So try not to move at all, we'll get everything right. We'll take a few shots on each pose and then change, because some models like to free flow where they'll pose and then move and then pose. You actually want them to hold the pose as much as possible. An even easier option is to have them leaning against a wall or sitting if they're in studio, much less chance of movement there. Keeping in mind, if you are shooting wide open, there's much more of a chance of them moving. Even 1/2 centimeter can be enough that you get it out of focus and it's no longer sharp. So here we go with a pose that she can hold solidly. A 30th and even a little bit lower down to a 20th is possible. Ideally, I wouldn't be down here though, but you know, if all else fails and you want the depth of field, then it's good to know you can do that with good VC. So let's bring all of those factors together now, and I want to get a portrait that has nice soft background. So I'm not going to be shooting at f8, but I know that this lens is fantastic from 2.8 to f4 for sharpness. And we don't condone smoking, but Irene insists on doing some shots with a cigar. So we want to get her sharp, the smoke starting to fall off to be soft, and then the background really nice and soft. Practicing all of those techniques we talked about. So we've got our gear, our settings, and our technique at play. So first off, let's set up the shot before we bring the cigar in, because I don't want you getting throat cancer. We shot array. I got a few different options here, checking where the light was. It was an overcast day. Then we got the cigar in to get a couple of different options there. Smoking kind of looks cool, but I kind of am not a fan of it as well. We reviewed the shots and got some more. One last thing that I should mention on not moving your camera, when you've only got a really small depth of field to play with, using the focus and recompose method can move your focus by 1/2 or a full centimeter. So I actually prefer to move the focus point right to where I want focus. So then when she is ready, I just start firing. I don't need to recompose. She's holding still, the camera isn't going to move at all. So I lock it in right on her eyebrow. I want to just hold the smoke in when you're first ready and turn to me. Hold it. Okay, go. So here's a few different options we got. These have been cropped in further, some of them, some wide shots as well. I wanted to have the skull on her one piece there to really show how bad smoking is for you. Going in on this one, following all the tips that I gave, there's just so much fine detail. You can even see those tiny fine hairs you can barely see with your eye. Okay folks, so if you follow all of those tips, you've got the best chance to get a pin sharp portrait. Now, of course, you need to start with a high quality lens like this Tamron 85mm. If you don't start with a sharp image, you just can't follow it through for the whole process. So you need to start with that. But once you've got the gear sorted, you get your settings right, make sure your shutter speed's fast enough, keep your ISO really low, shoot at the optimal aperture for your lens, and then your technique, making sure they don't move, you don't move, and if you can get a VC lens, you activate it, you're gonna have the best chance of getting the areas that you want crystal clear sharp. Those last shots we got of Irene smoking, very bad for you. she is in perfect, crisp, sharp, 100% res, perfect detail there. But then we've got the background completely blown out and soft, and we've got the smoke already starting to fall off, because at 2.8 and f4 we just have that smaller depth of field, but it's nice and sharp with this lens. Hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what kind of technique videos you'd like to see in future, and let us know what you like to shoot your portraits with as well. Thank you for joining me today, Irene.
Don't smoke.
We'll see you soon.